This lecture is all about external and internal gas exchange. If I talk about external gas exchange, this is occurring between the lungs and the blood. The air came from externally, the CO2 is leaving to go externally. That's external respiration. Internal respiration is gas exchange between the blood and the cells of a tissue bed. If you are reading those two chapters that I suggested you read, they then talk about internal respiration as using the oxygen in the cells. That is incorrect. I am right. Utilization of oxygen is cellular respiration. Yeah, there's a difference. The problem is when we're talking about getting the gas, like oxygen, from the air we are breathing and into our blood, we've got oxygen going from a gaseous phase into a liquid phase. And the gases freak out over that a little bit. It all depends on how soluble they are. So we have to talk about this solubility issue in order for us to appreciate how much will diffuse into our blood. Let's start with one of our first of many laws that I have to teach you tonight. This is not the first time you've seen Fick's law for the rate of diffusion. In no way do I ask you to calculate anything with this. But you better know what's in the numerator versus the denominator. And you should know the relationship. If something is in the numerator, it's going to have a direct effect on the rate of diffusion. If it's in the denominator, it's going to have an inverse relationship. So look what's in the numerator first. Surface area we've already addressed. We know that you have approximately the surface area of a tennis court in your lungs for gas exchange. If surface area goes down, what's going to happen to the rate of diffusion? It's also going to go down. What diseases did I tell you about? Or name one where the thickness also changed. Not just surface area, but thickness, the distance. So chronic bronchitis with all of the mucus, remember? That increases the distance. What do you think that's going to do? If that number goes up, the rate of diffusion goes down. So go back to surface area. Which disease did I tell you surface area was compromised? It was emphysema. Remember our alveoli that collapse into fewer but bigger ones? That's a lost surface area. Pressure gradient. That's something we got to talk about tonight. The driving force to get gases into the solution and out is a pressure gradient. That's different than concentration gradient. And I have to teach you why that's different. Gases flow from high pressure to low. And they will continue to flow until the two pressures are matched. And I'm going to show you a slide on that tonight. Each individual gas has its own pressure. I have to tell you why. I also have to tell you what kinds of gases are in the air you are currently breathing. And you need to know their pressure gradients. They're different. You don't need to memorize them, but you need to know which gases have the highest pressure gradient, which ones have the lowest. Then there's something called diffusion coefficient. And this is dependent not only on the molecular weight of the gas, but its solubility. We know things can change in their solubility based on temperature, right? But we're homeotherms, so we don't have to worry about that. That's not a factor. Our temperature isn't drastically changing. So the solubility of the gases will also be your responsibility. You don't need to memorize numbers, but you should know out of nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2, which one is the least soluble, and which of those three is the most soluble, and which one's in the middle. Okay, so keep Fick's law in mind as I go through more laws. On Tuesday, I tried to get you all to play, if you remember. You were not as enthusiastic about it as the morning class. The morning class is like, yes! let's play. And then I couldn't settle them down to get back in their desks. And their small room, I took them into the cold room because it was a smaller class. And they were like, we are definitely hitting each other now. So here you are, big classroom. How many strikes did you have on the walls? Less. Smaller room? More. Okay, so we have that. Pressure and volume are inversely related. Well, let's say I have a mole of helium. And let's say I add another mole of helium in here. Will I have more strikes or less? More. More, of course. I would have more. What if I have a mole of helium and a mole of oxygen? 2 moles. Same number of strikes. I've doubled them. So pressure from the gases hitting their chamber. We talked about that last night, or Tuesday night. You also learned about air pressure. This column of air goes up to 32 kilometers above you, about 1 meter wide in circumference, and it has a weight. Remember, I got down on the floor. The air is too heavy. Mommy, I will hold it up. It's 1 atmospheric pressure, this column of air, and that is 760 millimeters of mercury. We know that gases, if they are pushed into a smaller volume, we did this experiment on Tuesday, they're going to exert more strikes, more pressure. There we go. Now another law, Dalton's law. You see this gas that you are breathing? This air that we are breathing? It's a mixture, more than one gas. Most of it, about 79% of it, is nitrogen. The next most abundant, about 21%, is oxygen. The least abundant is CO2, and clearly I'm not including any other like pollution gases, water vapor. Let's just stick to these 3. They are the great majority. Dalton's law says, go back to that box where I said, what if we had a mole of helium and a mole of hydrogen? Remember that? Okay. Those were 2 gases and they were equal. They were equal in proportion. Dalton's law says, but what if you have a gas mixture where it's not equal in proportion? If you want to find out what the pressure is for a particular gas, what its contribution would be to the strikes on the vessel, you merely multiply 760 times the proportion of that gas. So, for example, nitrogen, you heard me say it's 79% of the air you're breathing. So if I multiply 0.79 to 760, I get 600 millimeters of mercury. So out of the 760, nitrogen provides 600 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure strikes. I could do the same thing for oxygen. I get 160 millimeters of mercury. I can do the same thing for carbon dioxide. Okay. So those are the individual pressures for those gases. You heard me say all of the gases I'm telling you about tonight have their own pressure. And if you remember Fick's law, pressure was in the numerator. So clearly nitrogen has a greater pressure gradient than oxygen. Well then try and make a prediction. How much nitrogen then do you think is getting into our blood? Not a lot. So why? Because 600 is more than 160.
It has to overcome a higher pressure gradient.
No, well, that is a high pressure gradient.
In comparison to 760. Right?
That's the great majority of it. So if just from what you know now, if pressure gradients drive the gases into solution, make a prediction. Which gas would go in more? Nitrogen. You should predict nitrogen. But that turns out not to be the case because solubility. So just from this prediction alone, you would predict we get more nitrogen in our blood. But we have to talk about solubility. Welcome to Henry's Law. So wow, in the first 15 minutes, we've covered 3 different laws. Henry's law states, if you want to take a gas in the gaseous phase and push it into solution, you must multiply 2 things, the pressure gradient and the solubility. So nitrogen's pressure gradient is 600, but the amount that actually gets into our blood is quite low because its solubility is so low. So I'm going to tell you a story to help you with this, okay? When Mac was an infant, both my babes, they were extremely colicky babies, extremely. And it drives you batshit crazy. And Mac, his sweet spot, I could get him to calm down if I put him in a tub of warm water. He loved water. The kid was clean because he was in the tub multiple times a day because I needed a break. I didn't leave him unattended. I see you judging me. And he loved being in my sister's swimming pool. He loved it. So out of desperation to get out of the house and yet keep him happy, I thought, I'm a genius. I'll sign him up for swimming lessons. I'm a genius. We'll do some mommy and me classes. Oh, gold star. So we'd show up to the pool. He'd get all excited. We'd get in the pool and the instructor would be there. And we'd start singing songs like, motorboat, motorboat, go so slow. Motorboat, motorboat, go so fast. Motorboat, motorboat, step on the gas. And we'd swirl the kids around in the water. And we'd sing songs and lift them up and then drop them in the water and pick them up. And he hated that. He just wanted the water, none of this other stuff. Oh, he screamed his head off. And so the next time I brought him, he was not having it. And the instructor said, give him to me, let me try. He's screaming his head off. I peel him off. I have to throw him to the instructor, and she's not letting him come back to me. We ended up getting kicked out of the class. True story. He was that bad. So anyone here ever teach swimming lessons? No one? There was someone in the morning class. And I said, am I right in describing that when you have that difficult kid coming, you can hear him screaming from the parking lot? And she said, oh yeah. And I said, am I explaining it correctly that when that parent comes, they peel that kid off of them, the instructor moves to a deeper part of the pool, parent throws the kid to the instructor so the kid can't swim back to the ledge. And then the kid climbs up and is like this on the instructor's shoulders while the instructor has all the other kids on their arms and they're playing and having a good time. She said that's exactly what happens. So I want you to think of nitrogen as that kid that doesn't want to go in water. I don't want to go. I want out. I want out. I want out. The gas with the least solubility is going to have the highest pressure in your blood. Why? It doesn't want to be there, so it's striking your vessel walls. I want out, more pressure. Let me out. Oxygen requires less pressure because it has a better solubility. That's good for us because oxygen has a smaller pressure, doesn't it? 160 millimeters of mercury. I know. So thankfully for us, we can get quite a bit of oxygen into our blood because oxygen solubility is much better than nitrogen. Again, you want to push more gas into solution. If you can't change the pressures, then you're looking at solubility. If you can't change solubility, then you're looking at changing the pressures. Our solubility for these gases doesn't change. We're homeotherms. So the only way we can push more of them is by changing the pressure. If I want double the amount of oxygen in my blood, I have to double that pressure of 160 millimeters of mercury. How do I do that? We give patients oxygen treatment, don't we? That's increasing, according to Dalton's law, that's increasing the proportion of oxygen that they're breathing. That means a greater pressure. Then that means more of the oxygen will get into that patient's blood. What about CO2? Well, CO2. CO2 is that kid that shows up for swimming lessons going, you want me in? You want me to get it back out, get it back in? Yeah, I'll just keep going. I'll do whatever you want. I'm just happy to be here, and I'm happy to be here, and I'll just go wherever you want me to go. That's CO2. Very soluble. And if the pressure of CO2 builds up in your alveoli, then that means more CO2 goes back in the blood. You want me to go this way? Okay. And that's where we started talking about hypercapnia. Remember, too much CO2 in the blood. So from now on, when you open a soda and you hear, psst, what are you doing? You're releasing pressure. And when you pour that soda in a glass, I want you to watch all of those bubbles. They're coming out of solution. That's the gas escaping the liquid phase. Now leave that soda on the counter for 2 days, come back and drink it. What's wrong with it? But what does that mean? Those gas bubbles came out of liquid, went down their pressure gradients out into the atmosphere, right? Bicarbonate out here is very low. So every time you drink a carbonated soda or beer, you cannot drink until you go clink, Henry's Law. Then you can consume it. Yes, Sean.
Is the molecular weight of the nitrogen, oxygen, and what was it, carbon dioxide to the solubility?
It has something to do with the diffusion coefficient, if you look at Fick's law. But the solubility in Henry's Law, that one in our body is not changing. Those are fixed and constant. Yes.
Sorry, you said hyperapnea is too much.
Hypercapnia.
Okay.
So let's go over Henry's Law a little bit more. If you want more of a gas dissolved in a liquid phase, your choices are either to muck with the solubility or muck with the pressure. For us, clinically, we really don't have a lot of control of the solubility part, but the pressure gradients, we can. It's easy to give a patient to breathe more oxygen, for example, to increase the pressure in the alveoli and drive more oxygen into solution. That's the one we manipulate. At equilibrium, there is no net gain or loss of the gases transitioning from the liquid phase to the gaseous phase. We have to talk about this because if we think of this circle, this chamber, as an alveolus, we know that we have the gases in that vapor phase and the blood arriving in our pulmonary capillary beds. That plasma represents a liquid. It's water, most of it water. If we want these gases to get into our blood, they need to go down a pressure gradient. Oxygen's going to come in. Nitrogen will come into our blood. It does. Just not in high quantity. That's concentration. Why? Solubility is poor. But it does get in. And CO2, well, CO2 is coming from our tissues. It's high in the plasma. And that pressure is higher in the plasma than CO2's pressure in our alveolus. And so CO2's like, and I gotta pull now. I came out. And then you breathe it out. Constantly making the alveolar pressure for CO2 lower than the CO2 pressure in your plasma under normal healthy conditions, of course. Pressure and concentration are not identical. They have different units. But you can think of them as being directly related. If you double the pressure of a gas over a liquid, you will double the amount of that gas in the liquid. They are directly related. If you triple the amount of pressure for one particular gas, you will triple the amounts of that gas in solution. They are not identical, but they are correlated, directly related. See, that was an easier way to start, talking about pressures. If I had started with addressing solubility, you probably would have had a big brain fart if I started with this slide. In this slide, at time 0, I have 2 different gases in 2 different chambers. They have 8 moles here, let's say, 8 molecules, let's just say molecules, and each one is striking the surface of the water, because they have equal quantities, with the same pressure, 100 millimeters of mercury in this example. At the end of, say, 5 minutes, I actually quantify the amount of oxygen versus CO2, and I see that I have more CO2 in the solution. Why? They had the same pressure. CO2 is more soluble. Exactly. Yep. Absolutely. But at the end of this, they are both at equilibrium. Equilibrium does not mean you have equal amounts of the gas in the liquid and in the air phase above it. That's not what it means. Equilibrium means the pressures are now the same, and there is no more net gain or loss of the gas going from one phase to the next. The swap is equal. Okay, I'm about to tell you a very sad story, and I test you on it too. So some of the people that I'm about to name, you have to know them. They are a perfect application of these gases that we are breathing. Tragically, 2 out of the 3 people I'm about to tell you died. First, let me tell you, or remind you again of Henry's law. If you double the pressure of a gas, you double the amount of it in your plasma. Scuba divers are a perfect application of how wrong Henry's law can be if you do not obey it and mind it. When most recreational scuba divers dive, they have an air tank. You know that. What's in their air tank? Yes, air. What kind of air? This air. They're breathing the same air we are. Same. And they go underwater. Now they have 1 atmospheric pressure from the air above them, but for every 33 feet-ish that they dive, they get another atmospheric pressure. The pressures are doubling. Oh. So what's happening to the amount of nitrogen going in their blood if the pressure doubled? It doubled. Of course. They go deeper. 3 atmospheric pressures. What's happening to the amount of nitrogen now? It tripled. Good. Swimming, 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 having fun, seeing fish. Shark! Scared, 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 scared. Shoot to the top. They are perfect human soda can. If they come up too fast, all those nitrogen bubbles, remember, I want out, I want out, I want out, I want out. You finally release the pressure, I'm out. And the nitrogen will bubble out of blood into the person's cranial cavity, in joints. And this is the reason why we call them, this condition, the bends, because they can't extend their joints. Extremely painful. And there's only one thing you can do to help them. There's only one thing. You got to get them back under pressure. You got to resolubilize. Look, that's it. That's the only option. Resolubilize the nitrogen and then slowly release the pressure. Yes?
Why did nitrogen do that again? Like, why did it start coming up?
It's the one that's the least soluble. It wants out of the liquid. It is also physiologically inert. It's not like we consume it. Oxygen we use. So nitrogen, we're not using it physiologically as a gas. It bubbles out, just like the bubbles, the bicarbonate bubbles out in your soda. It doesn't matter if it's not in the lungs bubbling out, it doesn't matter. Yes, John?
So what would be like the adequate time for them to resolubilize?
Okay, so anyone here scuba dive? Let me tell you, when you scuba dive, there are certain rules they beat into you. One of the first rules, you don't dive alone. You always have a partner. Second rule, you plan your dive, and you have to stick to your plan. You plan your dive in the way of this. How deep am I going to go, and how long will I be there? Why do they worry about the depth? Pressure. How long are they there? The longer they're there, the more the gas has the opportunity to get in. You dive your plan, and part of your planning is you have a dive calculator, but you also have to be able to do this by hand. So they make you do all this math, and they have dive charts and stuff, but they want you to be able to calculate it on your own by hand, confirm it with the dive charts, and even a triple confirmation with a dive calculator that you can wear on your wrist. It will tell you how much you can ascend. So if you dive deep, you have to come up slowly, and that's called a decompression dive. You come up a certain height, and you float. You just float, and you learn to adjust your dive vest so that you have buoyancy where you don't have to swim, and you just float. And you're told, blow out, blow your bubbles, blow them out. You're allowing some of the nitrogen to bubble out safely. Then after that certain amount of time, you go to the next height and you float. And I have been on decompression dives where my calculations said I had my last one, I was like 3 inches under the surface. I could see everyone else in the dive boat, and I'm like, I'm still here. Keep blowing out. If you think you've got sharks underneath you, you're not a happy person at that point. So you do your planning, you stick to your dive. You never dive alone. And most times you dive with a dive master. And the dive master has the extra responsibility of doing a check on you. You see, because gases under pressure can do weird things to your neurons. When you're underwater, CO2 no longer is the primary gas that controls your ventilation. It's supposed to be. Normal CO2 pressure, remember, is 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. If it goes up to 47, your ventilation rate could easily double. It tells your brain to do this, to change your ventilation rate. And I'm going to tell you how, but not right now. But under pressure, CO2 no longer does that. And so when you're swimming under pressure, you forget to breathe out. And part of your training in scuba diving classes, they tell you, you've got to remember to breathe. Blow your bubbles, they tell you. Breathe out. Focus on breathing out. And here's why. If you don't breathe out your CO2, you will black out. That's called CO2 blackout. If you black out underwater, guess what happens? You're no longer swimming. You're probably also not holding your regulator in your mouth. You're probably going to drown. So the dive master controls the group and does checks. They have tablets that they can write on underwater. And then they might give you a math problem to see how good you are, how you're coping. And there's also another thing that happens with nitrogen. You could take nitrogen underwater, not only do you get more of it in your blood from pressure, it has a Martini effect on your neuron physiology. We call this nitrogen narcosis. So if you're underwater at depth, let's put this together, you get the martini effect. When you're drunk, that effect, could you imagine having to remember to breathe out? So that simple task becomes very difficult. And then if you're not breathing out, you get the CO2 blackout. Nitrogen narcosis leads to poor decision making. Not breathing is a poor decision. You will black out. So in South Africa, there is one of the longest freshwater caves. It's called Bushman's Hole. And it is 927 feet deep. You can read this article. It's from the Outside magazine. And this is how I interpret Bushman's Hole based on the article. It has what they call a chimney part, where it's very narrow, difficult to get in. Then it expands, and at the bottom, 927 feet down, the cave goes more horizontally. And a group of divers were diving in Bushman's Hole. They were starting to ascend, and the dive master is the last one up, and he counts how many people he sees decompressing above him. He comes up one short. He looks down into the abyss, and he sees a cave light swirling down to the bottom. And he knows that means that someone has blacked out and dropped their cave light, and they're dropping too. The dive master tries to go after that person. Someone else in the group grabs them, because they know the rules. You stick to your plan. Grabs him, and with the cave light on his face, does this. And the dive master knew that it would be certain death if he tried to go after that person. He didn't have the air time in the tank. He wouldn't survive himself. So the person who went down to the bottom, his name was Dion Dreyer. Dion Dreyer. What killed him? First he got that nitrogen narcosis, and then he had that CO2 blackout, and he stopped breathing and drowned. Two gases were his problem. A time later, another group of divers, they're going to dive in Bushman's Hole, but their plan is to send a whole team of them so that one of them can get to the bottom. The extreme person in their group, his name was Dave Shaw. Dave Shaw could get down to the bottom in a matter of a minute or so. Getting down wasn't the problem. But when he came back up, it would take him 9 hours to decompress. Why would we dive this? He was an extremist. He got a thrill out of this. To make things worse, for him just to go down there for just a few minutes, it required 9 hours of decompression time, and he would need a series of partners hovering at different heights so that when he started to come up, they could check him, make sure he's with it, give him some more air tanks, and then they would have to start to ascend. So the one down here would take him, 8 hours or something? This is not fun for me. They thought it was hoots. So Dave Shaw's best mate and the first person who was his relay was Don Shirley. Now they wanted to send Dave Shaw down there. They wanted him to take this cable and anchor it and then go through that horizontal tunnel with that cable line and anchor it in there. And the reason was, when people do cave diving like this, their fins kick up the silt. So going into a cave is not the problem. It's turning around and all the silt is there. They get disoriented, they can't find the way out, and they drown. So with the cable, they thought, oh, aren't we a genius? We can follow the cable. So they sent Dave Shaw down there, and Dave Shaw is starting to put this cable down, and he comes across the body of Dion Dreyer. goes over to the body, and he tries to pick up Dion Dreyer's body so that he could at least try and bring it up to the surface, and it is stuck in the silt. So he's grunting, he's working hard at breathing at this point, and he remembers, I'm not diving my plan now. We'll come back another day. So he starts his ascent, and he gets to Don Shirley. Don Shirley assesses his cognition and awareness and thoughtfulness, and Dave Shaw writes on the tablet, found body. And Don Shirley knew one thing for sure. Oh, they were going to be back. They were going to get that boy's body. He was only, Dion Dreyer was like young 20. I think he was 22. So Dave Shaw contacts Dion Dreyer's parents and says, do you want us to go down and try and retrieve your boy's body? Or do you want us just to let him be? And the parents said, yes, please, go get his body. Yes, we want to give him a proper burial. It's important to us that he's not down there, quote, alone. So they plan, and they orchestrate this plan on prying his body out of the silt and then putting his body in a body bag, hoisting it to the cables, and they can just kind of pull it up. They practice. They get the local police involved, first responders. The day comes. They have a hyperbaric chamber there just in case something goes wrong and someone ascends too quickly. Everything's in place. That's Dave Shaw. He had a very special suit and equipment where it would help scrub out his CO2 so he could rebreathe the air, and it didn't require him to have all these tanks on his back. So it didn't scrub out all of the CO2, but it helped. He learned how to take his mouthpiece out and even eat underwater because he's there for 9 hours. I mean, he was very talented, but still, wow. Yeah. So he gets down there, he finds the body, and Don Shirley is hovering above him, watching him, and he can see the cave light moving around. And Don Shirley knew, as long as he saw that light moving around, Dave was okay and doing his job. So Dave gets the body free from the silt, and then the unexpected happened. You see, Dion Dreyer's body was in a wetsuit, and when it decayed, it turned into this waxy, oily substance. And as soon as it was free from the silt, it had buoyancy. And so now you have this body floating and is a moving target. And that's not something they were ready for. So Dave Shaw is trying to holding his light, and he's trying to get this body into this body bag. And what ended up happening, he's getting wrapped up in the cables. He's getting ensnared. His breathing is starting to be a struggle. He's grunting, and he makes a very bad mistake. When they first posted this on YouTube, they had the sound. I believe the video is still there because he had a camera on his helmet. And the sound was horrible because you could hear him grunting and trying to breathe. The big mistake he made was he dropped his dive light to get scissors to try and cut through these cables. And now he's not diving his plan. He's not breathing. He's not making good decisions. So now we have the nitrogen narcosis kicking in, and then he stopped breathing. Don Shirley sees the cave light not moving anymore, and he knows Dave is in trouble. Don Shirley makes another mistake. He goes down trying to get to Dave. But he's not diving his plan now either. And he was not used to going to any depth beyond what he normally went to. As soon as he tried to go down deeper, two things happened to him. One, it bursted his eardrum. And now he's got water flooding into his middle ear, and that's causing him to be disoriented. It's like being in a washing machine. He's got vertigo. Two, his dive calculator cracks under the pressure. Now he knows he's in trouble because he's not diving his dive. He went deeper. He has to recalculate everything in his head. You try doing math when you're drunk. Get out a calculus book. See how well you do. He starts to ascend to the next person to relay the information. Because he went deeper, that first checkpoint was not appropriate for him. So when he gets to that checkpoint, the person assesses him, recalculates for him going back up, but at this point, not only does he have the burst eardrum, but he's starting to get the nitrogen bubbling out. The person in the next relay at least had the presence of mind to clip him to the cable, so that if he died, at least he wasn't going down the bottom with the other two. And he writes, before the person leaves, Dave not coming back. So they finally get everyone out, except for Dave and Dion. Don Shirley, his problem with his gas was the bends. That was his problem. When he got to the top, they had to put him in the hyperbaric chamber. The only option is to put him back under pressure. So you either take him down to the depth again, or you put him in a hyperbaric chamber. Taking them down to the depth again is probably not a safe option if they're running out of tank air. So they go up, they're in excruciating pain. You put them in the hyperbaric chamber, you have to resolubilize that gas and then slowly release the hyperbaric chamber pressures. Next day, because of all these tanks and all these people and the tanks for the people, they had to clean up all the tanks from this chimney area and expanded region. And the last person coming up collecting the tanks gets to the top and everyone's excited. And then he's like, what are you all so happy about? We failed, we lost our buddy. What are you so happy about? Did you see him? Did you see him? See who? Dave, did you see him? He's like, no, what are you talking about? Dave's down at the bottom of the hole. They said, no, he's not. Dave's body started to decompose. Gases came out. He rose to up here, just like Dion Dryer's body probably did when he first died. But no one was there to see that happen. And then he decomposed even more and went down to the bottom and got stuck in the silt. Not only was Don Shirley's body in close range for them now, but he still had Dave Shaw's body, I should say. He was still stuck in those cables, and trapped also in the cable was Dion Dryer's body. So they ended up retrieving both their bodies. Now, I drew Dion Dryer's body correctly. His head was not in that wetsuit, obviously, and so it completely decomposed and it fell off in all of this. But at least they got the body. Some professional divers, if they're going really deep and they need good tank time and they can't be, laden down with all these tanks, they'll breathe something called a trimix. And it's got nitrogen, helium, and oxygen, and the helium helps make the tank a little bit lighter, like a helium balloon. All of these gases under pressure for long term are going to affect neurophysiology. I don't want you to memorize all this. I just want you to know going to great depths for a long time is going to lead to consequences. And we have a family friend who is an industrial diver. He goes to great depths for quite some time, and he is a sweet man, loving husband and father, but...
Is he related to Professor Shaw?
No.
Oh, just a similar last name.
Similar last name. So, you breathe atmospheric air, right? We calculated those pressures, but by the time the gases get down into your alveoli, those pressures have changed a little bit. Why? When we get down to the alveoli, we have more CO2 down there. We talked about residual volume on Tuesday. Nitrogen still has the highest pressure. We have oxygen and we have CO2. Nitrogen and oxygen will get into the blood. Which one will get in more? Oxygen. Even though it has a lower pressure, it has greater solubility. Good. So here we have oxygen poor blood arriving in the pulmonary arterial. The PO2 is 40. The PCO2, I put it as 46. And as soon as that red blood cell gets into near this respiratory membrane, oxygen is going to enter the plasma and then go into the red blood cell down its pressure gradient. That will continue to happen until these pressures are the same. CO2 will go out of the blood and into the alveolus, and it will continue to do that until, again, the pressure is the same as the CO2 pressure in the alveolus. So the gases reach equilibrium. It does not mean that we have equal amounts of the gases in the two phases. It simply means their pressures have reached equilibrium. Gases go from high pressure to low. So if there is no gradient, you're not going to get more movement between the two phases. Are you okay with that? Okay. There's an issue. Not only is it difficult enough talking about pressure gradients, Henry's law, Fick's law, Dalton's law, insolubility, but we have another issue. We need blood. You just saw in the previous picture, we need blood to arrive, drop off the CO2, pick up the oxygen. We have to address this issue of matching your ventilation, the work of breathing, with the amount of blood showing up to pick up and drop off these gases. Issue. Most of the time, we're sitting upright, standing. We have gravity, and the lungs have height. Now we're talking about blood and air getting into our lungs. Because the lungs have height, and we deal with gravity, and air and blood have different densities, we're going to get a perfusion ventilation mismatch. Lower regions of the lung, thanks to gravity, will get more air and blood than upper regions. Those are called dependent regions. The issue is, yes, they get more air and blood, but not equal. They get more blood than air. Blood is more dense than air. Upper regions get less blood and air compared to lower regions, but they get more air than blood. They have a mismatch as well. Upper regions where we have more air than the blood arriving, well, we've just spent a lot of work to breathe, and that's now called a physiologic dead space. I did all this work to get the air here, and you can't be bothered to come pick it up? Well, then what's the point of it? Physiologically, that was a waste for me. The lower region's getting more blood than air. The blood is leaving and going back to the heart as if it never went to the lungs to pick up the air. There wasn't enough air down there. So we call that a shunt, a physiologic shunt. We have this mismatch, and I'm here to tell you, your lungs have another problem. It gets worse. But it'll get better, don't worry.
So does that get fixed?
Yeah, I'm gonna find out. But I have to address the problems that the lungs have to overcome. We know that we have alveoli all over with pulmonary capillary beds and all of these things that are in tight confinement. The alveoli can push on the blood vessel in between. So if the alveolus has high air pressure, because it's well ventilated, it could squish close the blood vessel, which means it's even worse now, this ventilation perfusion matching. We're not letting the blood get there. Upper regions have that problem. They have more air than blood and they squish shut the capillary. That's an issue. Lower regions, they get more blood than air, so that vessel stays open. Okay, that's good. And then zone 2, the middle region, well, it's intermittent. Sometimes the vessel wins, sometimes the alveoli wins. Why? Systolic pressure, diastolic pressure. Systolic pressure, blood vessel open. Diastolic pressure, too low, alveoli squish it shut. Oh my gosh, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And here's how your lungs try and restore the match. These are not new. You should not need to memorize this. Here's why. It's Unit 3. In Unit 3, you learned about active hyperemia. You learned that when CO2 levels in a tissue bed go up, CO2 tells the upstream arteriole to vasodilate. The other side of the coin, if CO2 levels are going up, oxygen is going down. That was also a signal for the upstream arteriole to vasodilate. When it comes to the upstream arteriole of the pulmonary capillaries, reverse that. If CO2 levels go up, it tells the upstream arteriole to constrict, vasoconstrict. Then reverse it again. Increased CO2 causes the bronchiole to relax. Bronchial dilation, as if to say this. You know what, blood? You don't want to come over here. This alveolus is filled with dirty air. We got a high CO2 content. And CO2, remember, is that gas. We're like, you want me to go over here? You want me to go over here? You just tell me where you want. Oh, you want me to go back in the blood. Great, I love swimming. So don't bring that blood over here. And bronchial, you need to vent. You open the chimney flue. Let's get this dirty air out. High oxygen in the alveolus. Oh yes, blood, come on. We've got oxygen for you. And body, bronchial. This body, we're trying to get this air here. We're good. Causes bronchial constriction. No more, you don't need to send any more here until we get this picked up. So all you have to do is remember your CO2 and what it does systemically to blood vessels. Reverse it for the blood vessel in the lung. And then reverse it again so that you know what it's doing to the bronchiole. High CO2, do you want the blood to come to that alveolus? No, and vent. High O2, do you want the blood to come? Yes, please come here, vasodilate, and you don't bring any more in here until we pick up what we already have. Make sense? Yeah.
Wait, sorry. So there's more blood and less oxygen in the lower part of the lungs.
More blood, less air.
Oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
So you would vasoconstrict the arteriole, but you would dilate the bronchioles. No, I said that opposite.
Yes.
You would vasodilate, but vasodistrict the bronchioles because you want to get the O2 out.
You want to get the O2 into the blood.
Or yeah. And then, so then up top there's more O2 but less blood.
Correct. So
Did I say
you
that opposite?
up top, start up top. It's
Start
easier
up
that
top.
way.
Okay.
Up top, you would want to bronchial constrict and open the vasodilate
So
the
that
blood.
the O2
So
can
we
go
can
into the
come
blood.
pick it up.
And
Yep.
then down below you have less O2 but more blood.
Mm-hmm.
So you would constrict the arteriole.
Yep.
And open the okay, that makes sense.
And then all of this system improves, by the way, when you exercise. The lungs get even better at this. An argument that exercise is a good thing for us. Most of the time, I have arguments that it's bad, don't I? So when the blood is actually going through the capillary bed, when the blood is going through this pulmonary capillary bed, it takes 3/4 of a second. 3/4 of a second. The diffusion and exchange of gases takes 1/4. 3/4 minus 1/4 gives me 2/4, also known as a half. That means there's a half second of reserve time for gas exchange. Do you have it? Yes. Do you need it? I hope you don't. But are there disease states where that half second of reserve time is used and they still need more? That's not going to be good, is it? And yes, there are disease states. Let's say we have a patient with some health issues. Let's say they have some chronic bronchitis issues, lots of mucus. This increases the distance. That means the rate of diffusion is going down. And that half second reserve time, they might be needing all of it and maybe more. We put them on a treadmill, heart rate goes up. Of course it does. Well then what happens to the transit time? So the amount of time, 3/4 a second, goes down because the blood is actually flowing more quickly. Now we don't have as much reserve time. And we push that person on the treadmill until we start to see signs on the EKG that their heart is in distress or that they have dyspnea, air hunger. So let's go back to Unit 1. How many molecules of oxygen can each hemoglobin molecule carry? 4. 4, right? 1 on each heme. Most tissues of your body, out of that 4, they only need 1 out of the 4, leaving 3 as reserve. We use that to our advantage. When you see someone who needs CPR, nowadays they tell you just do chest compressions, not breathe into them. And it's because we know of this 3 reserve. And they want more people to help. And if they take out the ooh factor of breathing into someone that they don't know, maybe they can at least stop and do chest compressions. So that's part of the thinking as well. So the heart, though, requires 3 out of the 4. If we have blood going to the lungs in this diseased person, and there isn't enough reserve time, then that means some of the blood is going back to the heart less well oxygenated. Instead of 4, we might have 2 or 3 only loaded. And then when that blood gets kicked out of the left ventricle, some of it goes in the coronary arteries to bring gas and nutrition to the myocardium. If we are dealing with blood cells that only have 2 and the heart needs 3, well then the heart is becoming hypoxic, anoxic, and there's going to be an infarct, isn't there? So we do these stress tests to see how much we can push a person, to see how subthreshold they are to the disease state. Are they this close? Then we might need to address this. Are they this far away from the disease state? Well, that's good. They're probably healthy, right? We don't have to worry about them. Okay, so that was all external respiration, gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Now let's go to internal respiration, gas exchange between the blood and the tissues of the body. We are delivering oxygen to the tissues, and we're going to pick up CO2. Okay, this invites now the concept, how do we deliver oxygen? Let's start with oxygen. How do we deliver oxygen? And then we'll talk about how do we pick up and transport CO2. So starting with oxygen. Your tissues of your body require 250 milliliters of oxygen a minute when you're at rest. That would be roughly half this bottle of water right here. That's the amount of air your cells, your 100 trillion cells, are using. That doesn't seem like a lot, does it? That's all they need when you're at rest. Is your cardiac output of 5 liters per minute sufficient for that? Is it? Well, we need to talk about how much oxygen we're able to transport, because that will determine if our 5 liters per minute is okay or not. How do we transport oxygen? two ways. Two ways. The first way we transport oxygen is, of course, when it goes from the alveolus and we push it into our plasma. How much? That's Henry's law. I multiply the pressure of oxygen in the alveolus to oxygen solubility. And when I do that, I get about 0.3 milliliters for every 100 milliliters of plasma. 0.3 milliliters. If oxygen dissolved in plasma were the only way we could transport oxygen, we would require a cardiac output of 83 liters per minute. This is the equation I used to solve for that. This is an equation I ask you to use in your homework packet too. So if that's all I can carry, and my tissues require this, then I rearrange the equation to solve for my cardiac output, and it's 83 liters per minute. Clearly not compatible with life. So there has to be some other way we carry oxygen. Unit 1. Lab Unit 1. Congratulations. We come full circle back to Lab Unit 1 and Lecture Unit 1. There's another way we carry oxygen. What is the definition of anemia?
Decreased oxygen carrying capacity.
What?
Decreased oxygen carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity. You calculated this in my blood. You did. Remember when I gave blood and you all played with it? You did the Tallquist test. And you took the color of my blood and you went, Kira, you've got 14 grams percent hemoglobin. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Then what'd you do to that number?
You multiply it by, I don't remember.
By 1.34 milliliters of oxygen for every gram of hemoglobin you have. And you calculated my oxygen carrying capacity. So the other way we carry oxygen, transport it, is in our red blood cells. That was Unit 1. Phone a friend, get the brain back. You need it. Whoever has it, say, I need it for the next week and a half. 2 weeks. So then that brings up another way to talk about oxygen in our blood. We say total oxygen content. This graph shows you how much we dissolve in our blood, in the plasma, according to Henry's law. The red shows you our oxygen carrying capacity. How much? That depends on your grams percent. That depends on how well your red blood cells are made and how many of them you have, of course. If I take a typical 15 grams percent, we can see if I add both of these together, I get total oxygen content. That brown graph hasn't shifted very much, has it? The great majority of the way we transport oxygen is carried in our red blood cells. How much? It depends on our red blood cells. How many do we have? How well filled are they? Let's revisit oxygen carrying capacity. What happens to it in a person with G6PD deficiency? They have sufficient red blood cells, don't they? But what's wrong with their hemoglobin? Phone a friend, this is coming back. Methemoglobin I'm seeing whispered back there, which is hemoglobin with iron in the +3 state. So this person might have adequate red blood cells, but they can't carry. Definition of anemia is reduced oxygen carrying capacity. So that was the number that you were trying to remember. Yeah. 1.34 mil of oxygen for every gram of hemoglobin. When you multiply the grams of hemoglobin to this number, you get the units mil/O2%. So if I add If I take 20.1, so if I multiply 15 times 1.34, I get 20.1. The amount of oxygen I can transport in my plasma is 0.3. This is 67 times more greater for carrying oxygen in our red blood cells. That's great. If I add both of these together, I get 20.4. That's your total oxygen content if you have 15 grams percent hemoglobin. We transport oxygen in two ways. Dissolved in the plasma, according to Henry's law, it's not very significant, and transported in our red blood cell, bound to the iron in the heme group. How much depends on the number of red blood cells we have and how well filled they are of hemoglobin. Then when we get to the tissues, we have to unload that oxygen. This is a reversible binding situation. Hemoglobin binds to oxygen, turns into oxyhemoglobin. It releases it to the tissues, we get deoxyhemoglobin. Okay. So how do we unload? And how do we load? It doesn't just happen. So we gotta talk about how physically oxygen loads and what makes it physically unload. Because remember, iron, in Unit 1, I asked you the question, why bother making the globin chains? If it interacts with iron, why not just use iron? Dust off that neuron, we did have this conversation. Why not just iron? And I'll tell you, I'll remind you, iron would never let go. And back in Unit 1, I told you it was those globin chains that dictated this reversible reaction. And you all went, okay. And I said, and let me tell you about the 3 different kinds of hemoglobin. Do you remember that? You better. We're right back into Unit 1, but we're redoing it more advanced. Why? You now have the knowledge where I can have this big boy, big girl conversation with you. Brooklyn's like, I was happy with the infantile one. Embryonic, alpha 2, epsilon 2, fetal, alpha 2, gamma 2, adult, alpha 2, beta 2. You learned that they were made in different places. Where are they made? Yolk sac, liver and spleen, bone marrow. After age 20, specifically axial. Okay, you also learned that they had different affinities. And back when you were little, first starting the class, I said, you know, when it's an embryo, they don't have their blood vessels in place, and they have to rip off the oxygen from mom's hemoglobin that's traveling in the uterine arteries. And that has to be able to diffuse. And I said, it's like a big, strong magnet. And you all went, okay. And then I said, when the baby actually develops the placenta and the blood vessels are closer together, the baby still has to rip off the oxygen. And I used that, didn't I? That's why you're laughing at me. You're remembering. But they're closer, so you don't need as strong of a magnet. And you all went, okay, check. And then I said, and then when the baby is born and the lungs are now getting the air, we transition again. We don't need such a strong magnet. And you all went, right then, that makes sense. There are physical reasons why. Now I can teach you why. So let's review affinity. The greediness, not wanting to let go. Very greedy. When is hemoglobin greedy? I need my oxygen. In the lungs. When is it giving? Here you go. In the tissues. Okay, well, there has to be a reason why these protein chains can switch the greediness chemically. On a molecular level, there is a reason. It's just not, the affinity changes. There's a reason. Okay, which couple has the highest affinity? The newlyweds, of course. Which one has the least affinity? The one where he can't even be bothered to look at her. Right? She's the only one holding on. And then after decades of marriage, like, I'm not holding your hand in the car! Just unlock the damn car! The affinity changes. I need to tell you about this affinity in more detail. You learned in Unit 1 that this was a reversible reaction. You're now learning that in the lungs we get loading, but I need to teach you why. And in the tissue bed, unloading. Fundamentally, you knew this even back in Bio 20 and anatomy. But now, you're going to learn why. I need you to think about this affinity, this greediness, not wanting to let go. So I'm going to tell you that the iron in the heme group does not stay perfectly centered. The iron moves up and down in that ring. When the iron moves up, you're watching me? Up, because this will save you, up. It's in a tensed position. And to me, that sounds like the word tense as in camping tents. So that's why I'm doing this. When it moves in the tensed position, it kicks off oxygen. Bling! Question now is, what makes it move up into the tensed position? There's a reason. When the iron moves down in a relaxed position, that's where oxygen can now bind. Tensed, bling, off. Relaxed, let me bind you, oxygen. Let me hold you. But something has to make that iron move. And it's something happening on the globin chains. And when we talk about an allosteric interaction, we say if there is an event somewhere on this molecule and it has a ripple effect, causes changes somewhere else, that's called an allosteric interaction. So something must be triggering the globin chains that in turn triggers that allosteric interaction with iron. And that's not the only allosteric interaction I'm going to teach you about. The globin chain on one group can actually signal the other three and say to them, hey, you might want to get your iron in the tensed position too. Or, hey, you might want to get your iron more in the relaxed state. We're on our way back to the lungs. So they not only communicate to their own heme group and iron, but they communicate to each other. And it's fascinating. And you get to learn about it. So, why am I showing you this family? Because I'm going to use a story of my family to help you with this allosteric interaction. Not only between the globin and its heme, but also the four globin chains talking to each other. There are 4 children in my family. There's me, I'm the oldest. My sister Shanna, she thinks she's the oldest, she is not. My brother Kalen, and my youngest sister Brina. When I left for college, packing my car, going down to UCSD, it took forever for my parents to let me go. I had to really pressure them. Mom, Dad, I gotta go. I need to go check in. And then my dad would be like, young lady, you're not leaving this driveway until you show me that you know where all your fluids are and how to check them. Because they call them dummy lights for a reason, young lady. If the light comes on, you're the dummy because you waited too long to check your oil and your coolant. And I'm like, fine, I show you, I know how. Where's your timing belt? Yes, Dad, I know where my timing belt is. You're gonna now change a tire. No, I'm not, Dad, because if you remember, part of my PE requirement to pass, I had to show that I could change a tire. True story.
Yeah, they don't do that, they should.
I went to an all-girls school and they wanted to build us into independent women, right? I know. So, I don't know. I'll give you a hint. If you try and use the crowbar, the T-bar, sorry, to get those lug nuts off, you know that in the shop they use a hydraulic drill to put on the lug nuts and it goes shoo shoo. It's really tight. Ladies, you probably don't have the upper muscle strength to get that torque. Get on the ground. Use your legs. Once you get them loose, fling, 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 fling. Easy peasy. Okay. Then my mom, Karen Ann, we need to go back to the store. You don't have enough food. How many times are you going to do laundry? We should get you some more laundry detergent. Just let me go. And finally, they let me drive away. My sister Shanna, she went to Cal State Fullerton. They wanted her to be independent. They still let her live off campus. Her leaving the driveway from Huntington Beach to Cal State Fullerton, 25-minute drive, okay? Same thing, they fretted over her, but not as much. They were already used to this, thanks to me going away. My brother, punt! Bye! But then my little sister, going to UCSD, the baby. Didn't require my sister to pressure my parents as much as I had to, but it was certainly more than my brother. The baby. How many molecules of oxygen binds to hemoglobin? 4. Why? Because there are 4 heme groups total. Exactly, right? If I have 1 bound to 1 heme group out of the 4, that is 25% saturated. If I have 2, that's 50%. If I have 3, 75%. And if all 4 are bound, it's 100%. So, down here, this y-axis shows you the percent saturation. If I go from 100 to 75, what happened? Oxygen left, one of the heme groups. If I go from 75 to 50, 2 left. Good, you're getting the game. Down here is the partial pressure of oxygen. When the blood first leaves the lungs, that partial pressure, if you remember from my slide, is 100 millimeters of mercury. By the time that red blood cell gets to a tissue bed, gas exchange has happened. The cells are using that oxygen. And again, we reach equilibrium. So by the time that deoxygenated blood leaves, it has a partial pressure gradient of 40 for oxygen. Okay, so what is that pressure gradient difference? What is that? Do that math. 60 millimeters of mercury to get how many oxygens to come off? We went from 100% saturation to 75. Just 1. Mom, Dad, let me leave. No, it's our firstborn. It's our first one leaving. Let's go from 75 to 50. How do you do that? Here's 50. I'm helping you with your homework packet if you're paying attention. You go over horizontally until you hit that curve, then drop vertically. What do you want to call that? 30? So to get a second one off, Shanna's leaving. How much pressure did she have to give my parents? 10. Still there. Okay, what about going from 50 to 25% saturated? Here? That's Kaylin. It's a little less than 10, isn't it? A little less than 10. Punt! To go from 25 down to 0, the baby, the last one, still is easier than when I left, but harder than the third. How are you doing 10? I'm doing the difference. So 50% saturation, drop down. Oh, that's 30. So to get the first one off, we had to go down to 40, didn't we? So 40 to 30, oh, that's the, okay.
So when you're going from, when we went down to 20 and we came over, we were at 20, is that a difference of 20 if we're comparing from 40? Oh, from 10 to 20, so another 10.
Roughly, depending on how you draw your lines.
Okay.
Should be a little less. When you come back from the break, we are going to continue on with this graph, which is called an oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So let's continue on. I had some questions about allosteric interactions. And believe it or not, you've been talking and learning about these since Unit 1. You have. I just didn't point it out as being an allosteric interaction. Do you remember this slide from Unit 1 when you learned about vitamin B12 and folic acid? And I said that they were coenzymes. And I told you that coenzymes help enzymes do their job. And you said, okay, that sounds good. And I said, for example, coenzyme binds somewhere on the enzyme, but it's not the official binding spot. Most of the time, the binding spots are closed. And you all went, okay? And I said, so substrate A and B, they can't get to the binding site. See the big X? But when that coenzyme binds, it opens the binding site. And now those substrates can enter the binding site. That's an allosteric interaction. Something that happened to this enzyme over here made changes over here. A conformation change. The amino acid shifted and opened up the binding site. That wasn't the only example. Unit 2, skeletal muscle contraction. Calcium binds to troponin. And you all went, and that causes a conformation change of tropomyosin to expose actin. What do you think that was? An allosteric interaction. Changes over here to this filament fragment made a change over here, exposing that actin. Those are all allosteric interactions. I just didn't make it sound so scary. So now we're back to our official PowerPoint that we started with. And the other confusion was, okay, so Kara, what is the allosteric interaction that's happening? What actually causes this? You know, what makes the iron move and what makes the 4 globin chains talk to each other? I haven't gotten there yet. I will. This takes time. I can't just bomb it on you and go, there, you know it all now.
Oh, I wish.
Learning's painful. You need to be very mindful when you look at oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves. Not every book shows them the same way. So I'm going to point out what every book does show, and then I'm going to point out the extra information that some books show. They all have the partial pressure of oxygen down at the bottom. They all have a y-axis that shows the percent saturation. Not all of them shows you a second y-axis where it shows you the oxygen content. How do we calculate oxygen content? I showed you a picture. And you could start to appreciate why not all charts show you oxygen content. Oxygen content is dependent on how much oxygen is dissolved in the plasma, dependent on Henry's law, plus your oxygen carrying capacity, which is dependent on your hemoglobin grams percent. Is that the same in you? Is that the same in you? Now you appreciate why many textbooks don't put this side. It's situational. This clearly was created with the idea of 15 grams percent. But what would that side look like if it wasn't 15 grams percent of a patient? What if they had 12 grams percent? This y-axis would have different values, wouldn't it? But even though the person might have decreased hemoglobin, what hemoglobin they have, 12%, could be perfectly fine. If it's perfectly fine, then when those red blood cells leave that person's lungs, they'll still be 100% saturated. If there's nothing else wrong with that hemoglobin. Do you understand? So these oxygen saturation charts typically don't have this content because it's situational. And the reason why I'm harping on this is because when we have 100% saturation, it doesn't tell you if the person's anemic. It doesn't. If you want to know someone's oxygen content, you need the lab to do two things. First, you got to draw arterial blood. You send that to the lab, and they tell you how much oxygen partial pressure is in that blood. If it's near 100 millimeters of mercury, then we know from our Henry's law that means about 0.3 milliliters of oxygen are dissolved per 100 milliliters of plasma. I showed you that math in an earlier slide. Then I draw a different kind of blood, venous blood, and I send that to the lab, and they will measure the hemoglobin grams percent in my patient. I multiply that by 1.34. Then I add the two together, and I get total oxygen content. So that's an absolute quantity. I add carrying capacity to the amount of oxygen that is actually dissolved in the plasma. Let's talk about pulse oximeters. They are machines that we typically put on someone's finger, and they detect a pulse, but they also tell you the percent saturation of the patient's hemoglobin. Okay, you're like, yeah, of course, that's pulse oximeters. I know that. That sounds so easy. I do not test you on pulse oximeters. I am bringing this up because frequently in a healthcare situation, people forget what a machine can and cannot tell them. It happens all the time. The last half of your homework packet, where it starts with a tutorial in gas laws, and you see the little waiter carrying the tray of food, from that on, that was written by a student of mine over a decade ago. She was master of her oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves. And she wrote that up to help her classmates and distributed to them. And when I saw it, I was like, this needs to go to everyone. Because you don't know what you don't know until you try those problems. You don't, especially the last page. She was in nursing school at Cal State Long Beach, and she had a test that she flunked, and now she was looking at being on academic probation because she flunked by 1 point. She was really upset over this. After this test, she goes out to talk to her classmates, and she came across a question where it said, which of these following items can be used to diagnose anemia? Something like that. She looked at the options. None of them seemed appropriate to her, so she left it blank. That was the one she could have gotten right. So she goes out to talk to her classmates. She said, where'd you put for that? I didn't think any of them were appropriate, so I left it blank, thinking that was, because they were tested like that. If you didn't see the right option, you left it blank. Her classmates go, oh no, there was. You put pulse oximeter. And Tristan goes, oh no, that is not okay. She's like, and I can prove it. So she goes to the professor during her ops hours and she says, I have an issue with this question. There is no appropriate answer. And the professor goes, pulse oximeter. Tristan calmly says, no, pulse oximeters show us percent saturation. They do not show us oxygen carrying capacity. The definition of anemia is a reduced oxygen carrying capacity. Oxygen carrying capacity is determined by sending blood to the lab, and they tell us how many hemoglobin grams percent the patient has. You multiply that by 1.34. Pulse oximeter does not do that. Professor says, well, that is the correct answer. And Tristan says, okay, let me explain to you, Professor. Do not memorize this. but a pulse oximeter is a spectrophotometer. So Tristan starts talking about spectrophotometry and the Lambert-Beer law. This pulse oximeter shines two different kinds of light, red light and infrared. These have different wavelengths. You know from your spectrophotometer that the machine shines the light, it interacts with some chemical, and out comes some light. The more of that chemical, the more blockage of the light. Remember that? Yeah. So Tristan starts explaining deoxyhemoglobin absorbs more with the red wavelength and less with the infrared, and goes through all of this, and is writing out the Lambert-Beer law. And then she draws an oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve and shows that the teacher sees percent saturation, but I can have a patient with 8 grams percent hemoglobin. They're anemic, but the pulse oximeter will still show what hemoglobin they have is fully saturated. It does not diagnose anemia. And then Tristan said, and if it did, my teacher would be very happy because then she wouldn't have to get her blood drawn for her students, for them to play with and determine if she was anemic. So the professor keeps saying, no, pulse oximeter, definitely yes. And Tristan's like, I think you should reconsider. Here is the evidence. So she calls me just angry. Are there any kids in the car? No. Expletive, 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 expletive. I said, Tristan, you're absolutely right. There was no correct answer choice. You are correct in your explanation. I'm sorry your professor isn't giving on this. So the next class time, what do stubborn professors do? If the student is actually making a good argument and something's not sounding right, they'll usually wait for the student to leave, then research it on their own or ask other colleagues and then go, oh yeah. So the professor couldn't still admit to it, but she said, I've decided to throw that question out.
Oh my God.
So Tristan passed and she wasn't on academic probation. Yay! Some terms that you might see in a book and certainly on the test, little p, capital S, A, O2, that stands for the O2 saturation in arterial blood. If you see little a, capital O2, that's the partial pressure of arterial blood of oxygen. So this one's the saturation of hemoglobin, like the pulse oximeter would show you. PaO2 is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, should be close to 100 millimeters of mercury. Capital AO2 refers to the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus. So that should be a little bit higher. It's going to be around 100 millimeters of mercury by the time that oxygen gets into the alveolus from the atmosphere. Carboxyhemoglobin. Carboxyhemoglobin does not interact with the wavelengths shown up here. Most pulse oximeters will not detect if someone has carboxyhemoglobin, which means hemoglobin bound to carbon monoxide. So if a pulse oximeter can't detect the carbon monoxide, by the way, carbon monoxide binds to iron. It occupies a seat. The traditional pulse oximeter would tell the nurse, oh, 100% saturated, nothing going on. You have to change the filter, use a different wavelength to get the pulse oximeter to go, oh, you only have 50% saturation. This patient's in trouble. And I'm going to tell you more about carboxyhemoglobin. I use these words on the test. Be careful. Oxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin that is loaded with oxygen. Deoxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin that's not as well saturated. Carboxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin bound to carbon monoxide. Methemoglobin, hemoglobin that has iron in the +3 state. Carbaminohemoglobin, I know. Yeah, I'll explain what that is just a moment. If you ever need to defend your answer, these are credible websites. I sent these to Tristan and said, send them to your teacher. Maybe it'll make a difference. All right, so this allosteric interaction, there are two of them. There's a change that happens in the globin chains causes the iron to wobble. The globin chains, if one of them changes, it causes the other 3 to also change, which in turn target their iron. So there are multiple layers of allosteric interaction. All right, is that right?
Yeah.
Good. Good.
Did I bring them?
Sounds like a board. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you these allosteric, what is actually causing this to happen? What are we talking about? Okay, I'm going to use an analogy. When the boys were younger, we used to watch WWE all the time. And I would take them to SmackDown concerts. Yeah, super fun. And we used to have family WWE SmackDown fights, little feuds. And it was usually all 3 of them against me. So I come home, I go to my honey, I bind to him, I give him a nice hug, a smooch. And when the boys were younger and they would see this happening, in their heads it was, oh, it's family SmackDown. We're already starting to feud and wrestle. Dad started it. And the kids would see this and they'd take a running start, jump off the ottoman, and the 2 of them would land on Chris's back. Now, before the kids do this, we have a nice affinity. Remember those pictures of the couple? We have a nice affinity. He's holding on to me, greediness, not wanting to let go. Kids on the back, whoa, he can't hold on to me as much. The irony should not be lost on you. There's always a lot more affinity when the kids are gone. That's how we got them. So I want you to think of Chris as the iron center of the heme. I bind to him. I am oxygen. The 2 kids that are jumping on his back, I want you to think of his back as the globin chains. So what are the 2 kids and where are they coming from that bind to globin, where now the iron loses the affinity for oxygen? Tensed, fling, away. CO2 and hydrogen. CO2 and hydrogen. Where is CO2 coming from? Where does it come from in our body? Tissues. Tissues. Unit 2, cellular respiration. Yes?
I was just gonna say something like those products or something.
Yeah, it's cellular respiration. So when the red blood cell, fully saturated, comes into the tissue capillary bed, and the cells have been metabolically active, that CO2 is like, oh, I'm going from high concentration to low. And there are other acids that you make. Remember, I taught you this in your acid-base lecture. Where are all these acids coming from? So as the red blood cell starts to enter that capillary bed, here comes the hydrogen and the CO2. Jump! And it gets onto hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin amino acids, now that they have this, changes the conformation, which in turn makes the iron wobble into the tensed position. And that is what causes the unloading of oxygen.
Not that the pressure gradient of oxygen is lower in the tissue, so it's automatically gonna want to move in that direction. It's the CO2 binds and then it gets let go.
Because otherwise iron is in the relaxed state. I'm not letting it go. It's too greedy. Not until the kids come. Changes, shifting, iron wobble, fling, tensed, there goes the
Why
oxygen.
does the CO2 want to bind to the...
Great question. And let's go back. You already know the answer. You do. You know the answer, you're just, we need to make these connections.
It would never let go of oxygen.
In your acid-base lecture, I had a red blood cell. And I said CO2 comes from the tissue bed, dissolves into the plasma, and into the red blood cell. And CO2 and water with carbonic anhydrase
Hydrate.
goes to carbonic acid. Remember this picture now?
Yeah.
Dissociates into hydrogen, and the bicarb goes out, and the chloride shifts in. Remember that?
Yeah.
And I said, oh no! We just traded a weak acid for a strong acid. And I said, don't worry, because hemoglobin is in here. Globin chains have a lot of histidine. And on that picture, it had this, HHB, for hemoglobin bound to hydrogen. Well, some CO2 that gets into the cell doesn't work in this reaction. Some of it also binds with histidine and hydrogen. You see, we carry carbon dioxide 6 different ways. We carry it in a morphed form of bicarbonate, that's one. We also carry it in the red blood cell bound to hemoglobin. That is a carbamino compound. Carbaminohemoglobin means CO2 that's bound to it. Then you go to the pulmonary capillary bed, and that reaction, remember, reverses. CO2 says to hydrogen, hey, this is our exit. We got to get off the bus. And the reaction flips. And that causes a conformation change again. The kids are gone. The affinity comes back, relaxed state. And that's what causes the loading. So you need two things. Do you need a pressure gradient? Of course. But that's not enough. The iron has to be in the correct position as well. Okay?
Sorry, so what made it so that CO2 wants to bind to the hemoglobin? It was the hydrogen?
So when you're in a tissue bed, those things are so plentiful, they diffuse, that's the pressure gradient, into the blood, and they keep going into the red blood cell, down their gradient. And once they're in there, it's like, we gotta be transported some way, and one of the ways is binding to hemoglobin. Now, two different scientists studied this reversible reaction, the loading and unloading. And they studied this reaction in different places. Bohr studied the unloading. Sorry, strike that, reverse that. Bohr studied the reaction happening in a tissue bed. Haldane studied the reaction occurring in the pulmonary capillary. So in the pulmonary capillary, we have loading happening, don't we? In the tissue bed, we have unloading of oxygen. Okay, so Bohr studied hemoglobin when the oxygen was being unloaded. But he found it interesting that hydrogen and CO2 bound to histidine residues in the hemoglobin. And he said, in this case, right here, what's the definition of a base? What's the definition of a base? Accepts hydrogen. So Bohr said, in a tissue bed, hemoglobin is a base. And Haldane was studying it in the pulmonary circuit. And Haldane was saying, no, hemoglobin is an acid because it releases the hydrogen. That's the definition of an acid. And it took a while for everyone to go, it's the same reaction, just reversible. It's the same coin, just opposite sides. You both are amazing. So now more correct textbooks, instead of calling this reversible reaction the Bohr effect, which I hope I'm not having on you, they call it the Bohr-Haldane effect. So here's what I want you to remember. Haldane, halitosis. That helps me remember breath, lungs, and that's where he studied. What is the most abundant vowel in the word Haldane? A.
Oh, you said
Vowel,
oh.
not a syllable.
Oh. I used to need this.
So it's A. Hemoglobin in the respiratory capillary bed is acting like an acid. Bohr's name starts with a B, and he was focusing on the blood in a traditional tissue bed. And he said, now hemoglobin is a base. So B for base and B for Bohr. Good? Good.
Is that the same board, or is that a different?
It's the same one. Okay, so it's CO2 and hydrogen causing this conformation change, this allosteric interaction. There's more. Other things can influence this allosteric interaction as well. Temperature and a substance called 2,3-DPG. Now, okay, I gotta teach you that that sigmoid curve that you saw in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves, it's S-shaped, so we say it's sigmoid curve. When scientists are studying a protein and we see this S-shaped curve, it makes our nipples hard. We get all excited because it screams allosteric interactions, and we want to figure this out. So there are other shifts that are going to happen to that curve. It can shift right or it can shift left, and I'll show you what that means in just a moment. But we have to go back to that greediness picture with the people hugging, okay? Greediness, affinity, not wanting to let go. When we have oxygen loading, iron's greedy, don't want to let go. It's not till the kids jump on the back, now I'm going to let go. Okay. We're coming to the holiday time, and I find it amazing, the difference in gift giving to different ages. You give a gift to a 3-year-old and say, I have something for it's already open before you finish the sentence. Okay? You try and give an adult a gift, say your neighbor, just because you saw something and it reminded you of them. You choose, here, oh no, I can't, it's too no, you keep it, because you can use it. No, but take, I want you to, no. When Hayden was little, he'd open his presents, of course, and my cousin, her child, would come over. She and Hayden are 6 months apart, so they grew up together. She was not a nice little girl. She would throw fits and scream and cry. Anything that Hayden had, it was hers. So before she would come over, I would say to Hayden, okay, Mommy needs to take back the toys and hide them until she's gone. How do you think that went over with a 3-year-old? Doesn't understand that, right? So the 3-year-old, no, you gave me mine. Greediness. Don't want to let go. Older person, here, you have it. No. You keep it. I don't need that. It's okay. You have more use for it. I want you to keep that in mind as I go through these shifting curves. And again, this affinity changes through allosteric interactions. What determines if iron is greedy or no, here tissue bed, you have it? Its state, its position. Is it tensed or is it relaxed? Besides hydrogen and CO2, temperature and 2,3-DPG can make iron even more tense, less greedy. There you go, you need it, tissue bed. Or can become more relaxed, more greedy, not gonna let go. Let's look at the influence of pH. In red, this is showing you the normal curve, normal condition. pH is 7.40. Notice what happens if we get into acidosis. There's a right shift in the curve. If we go into alkalosis, there's a left shift. Right shift. less greedy. And I'll prove to you why. You need a tissue bed, you need it. Left shift, 3-year-old. Mine, and you're not taking it from me. Let's go to 100% saturation, shall we? It's a little bit easier to start with that. What pressure is required to get the green graph to become 100% saturated? Where are you?
The green one, that would be.
Where are you? Where it's 100% somewhere here?
Yeah, around that, yeah.
Okay, 80? Mine! Doesn't take much convincing to say to a toddler, do you want to play? Yes. What about the blue one? We're not even to 100% saturation. We don't have options, do we? Oh, no. I don't want to load with oxygen. The tissue beds need it more. What about unloading? You want to go from 100% saturation down to 50? Draw a line across all 3 of these and then draw a vertical line down. To get 2 molecules of oxygen off the green left shifted, we have to go from 100 millimeters of mercury all the way down to about 20. That's a partial pressure difference of 80. But for the blue right shifted line, we only have to go down to what, 38? That's a more giving hemoglobin. You need it, tissue bed. You need it. Left shifted, oh, I'm gonna load up and I'm not gonna give it up. Acidosis, giving. Alkalosis, greedy. When is a tissue bed having more hydrogen? Because that's where it's coming from. When it's more metabolically active. Go figure. In Unit 3, you learned when tissue beds were more metabolically active, it caused the upstream arteriole to vasodilate and bring more blood. Oh my gosh, it's pretty much the same things that cause the hemoglobin to deliver more oxygen. You need both. Bring more blood and be giving with the oxygen. What if we look at CO2 changes only and hold pH constant? The shifting isn't as dramatic, to be sure, but it's there. When there's more CO2 around, right shifted, giving, oh my gosh, you need more oxygen. You have too much CO2. You're really busy, aren't you? More metabolically active. Less CO2, and you're not that metabolically active. You don't need that much oxygen. Step up your game a little bit. What about temperature? It also causes shifting. Warmer temperature, right shift. When is the temperature increased in a tissue bed? When it's more metabolically active, when it's consuming ATP and hydrolyzes that bond. Some of that energy is lost in the form of heat. Left shifted, colder temperature. So think about this. Let's say you have a near drowning experience. We're gonna bring you back. You're gonna be underwater. You're gonna inhale that water. You're gonna lose consciousness. We're gonna bring you back though, okay? The brain damage, though, is an issue. How long are you underwater? How much oxygen is your brain consuming while you're underwater? What would you rather be in, warm water or cold water, to have a better prognosis of brain function?